where I left off. Sorry for that technical difficulty, but it gave you a little time to sit back, put your feet up, have a beverage, call all your friends, family members, and colleagues to get on YouTube or Twitter or Facebook and start enjoying the show. And you can on Twitter as well as on YouTube, you can join us and send in your comments, and we can discuss them on the air. Let's skip forward a little bit since we've already been through this part. Again, what tonight's discussion is going to be about, for anybody who's just turning on now, is two topics: exposing the pro-Hamas policy at the DNC, as well as Hamas's strategy of tactical civilian sacrifice. For anybody who didn't catch earlier, we will have our host, as always, Mayor Weinstein, the former director of the Jewish Defense League in Canada, as well as our buddy Mayor Jolowitz. The two mayors for me, it's a nightmare, but please enjoy them. We also have a special guest with us tonight, the lovely Dr. Ray, who managed to stay afloat in a tsunami of powerful men throughout her career. And she actually was working at the prep school of West Point Academy, getting those young, tough men ready to be in the military. She also has more initials after her name than the Alphabet City, New York City. But moving along, I'll be in the corner there. I'm the silent partner. As you see, starting off, I'm not that silent, but I'll try to be quiet during most of the show. In case you did miss our introduction 10 minutes ago, the first topic will be that of the pro-Hamas policy at the DNC. For those of you who might have tuned in, I feel sorry for you. So, as recalled, for the second time tonight, President Biden had the nerve to say that those pro-Hamas, anti-Semitic, anti-Israel people yelling, screaming, and causing havoc in the streets have a point. The point is that they hate Jews, and they hate Israel, and they hate Western civilization.
Tension on the streets of Chicago as pro-Palestinian protesters gather outside the Democratic National Convention.
This is a massive protest heading through the streets of Chicago. Thousands of protesters, you can see behind me, headed to the United Center where the convention is taking place. And there's also, take a look over here, a massive police presence.
And of course, if it wasn't enough to just crash the party,
again, this was an unpermitted
decided to hang out at the Israeli consulate, which was not a registered event. They were not allowed to do
Snelling
that.
himself staring down the crowd from the front lines. Protesters again tried to engage with police, but were then funneled through the loop downtown. A combination of bike police blockades and uniformed bodies.
So is this the point? Is this the point they have? To create violence, destroy property, and form a mob that is really...
Okay, you see, they're really getting into it right there. All right.
Our second topic tonight, which we'll discuss in detail and get the input from Dr. Ray, is this policy I never heard of before, but it's called tactical civilian sacrifice.
Did you know there are no bomb shelters in Gaza?
Yeah, I did. I know. This is because of a strategy. It's called tactical civilian sacrifice.
Tactical civilian sacrifice, one of the most despicable strategies ever devised in the long and tragic history of human warfare.
Let's go back to the fact that there are no bomb shelters in Gaza. So how could that be? I mean, Hamas planned this war for decades. Every aspect was very carefully thought through. Their tunnel system is longer than the New York subway and the London Underground. Do you think they just forgot to make bomb shelters for their people?
That's a question for audience. Do you think they just forgot to make bomb shelters for the people? Well, I think the answer is quite prophetic. Came in 1973 when we were attacked by Syria and by Egypt. Peace will come when the Arabs will love their children more than they hate us, which Golda Meir said prophetically in 1973. So without any further ado, let me conclude my brief introduction by asking you all to join us in the fight against anti-Semitism. At israelnow.ca is our website. We're also on Twitter, we're on Facebook, we're on YouTube. Remember, never again isn't the future. Never again is now. Without any further ado, I'm going to sign off. I'm going to put Mayor Weinstein on the screen first, and then shortly after that, we'll invite our guest to join him. Mayor, how you doing tonight?
I'm doing well. Thank you very much, Gary. Let me ask all our supporters, people who are watching, if you could please share this show on your different platforms that you use, be it Instagram, Twitter. If you have email lists, we'd appreciate that. WhatsApp groups, very effective. We'd appreciate it. We'll reach a lot more people. There's a lot going on right now, and every single hour of the day, there's more anti-Semitism. In fact, today, early in the morning, we in Canada, we heard the news that over 100 Jewish institutions, synagogues, schools were threatened with bombs. So it's a very serious threat. And there has been attacks on Jewish institutions ever since October 7th. It certainly has intensified. The pro-Hamas gangs, they're not only targeting the Jewish community, but they're also targeting the Christian community. Last Sunday, there was an event at a Christian church in Toronto, and they had an event to celebrate Israel. And sure enough, pro-Hamas gangs went there to try and disrupt. Thank God we were there and identified people from the pro-Hamas gangs, and they were not able to enter into the premise. The event went on. It was very successful, and the church, in fact, sang at the conclusion a tikva. Very nice of them. So we have a lot to discuss tonight. You hear the chants accusing Israel of genocide. Yet there is a calculated strategy from Hamas. First, they launch an attack on Israel on October 7th. They expect there's going to be a response. It's going to be a war. As the video showed before, there are no bomb shelters in Gaza. They have a strategy. They want to maximize the amount of deaths in Gaza in order to get some kind of world sympathy and try to get the world to turn on Israel. Look at us, we're all innocent. They have a tunnel system. We're going to be discussing it tonight. So let me first bring on, well, let's have both of our guests to join us, and we could fire questions and be very interesting. They are with us. Mayor, this strategy of Hamas, they want the death count to go up so they could accuse Israel, and they launched the war. We have Joe Biden, who calls the pro-Hamas.
Time out, freeze. Everybody needs to adjust their cameras so their faces are on the screen in this picture, okay? So please do that before you start talking. Over and out.
Okay. Okay. So, Mayor, we heard Joe Biden that he said he decided to run against Donald Trump because he falsely accused Donald Trump of talking about white supremacists and neo-Nazis and saying something so-called positive. There's great people on both sides or something like that, trying to infer that he's saying the Nazis are good guys, and all of a sudden, and that has been proven false, that statement. And at the same time, all of a sudden, Joe Biden himself talks about the pro-Hamas gangs marching outside the DNC, and he calls them fine people who have a point. Mayor, explain it to us.
Well, this problem is quite old. In fact, when I began lecturing many, many decades ago, I talked about this problem, and I'll be talking about it for as long as I will be lecturing. There is a fundamental problem that we have that we play into. We expect the world to understand that the truth is self-evident, and whereas the truth ought to be self-evident, it clearly isn't. Allow me to begin with this. We talk about Gaza. We've done this on a number of occasions in previous shows. There's a fundamental misunderstanding of the very nature of the conflict, and we play into the hands of our enemies.
Mm-hmm.
The reality is that the Arab world hasn't come to terms with the Jewish right to exist at all, certainly not in the Middle East. And we have somehow ignored this, pretended that the war that the Arabs have launched against Israel and against the Jews is territorial. And if it was territorial rather than the religious war that it really is, it means that if certain buttons are pushed and then the right buttons and certain lines are moved on certain borders, that somehow there'll be peace in the Middle East. It's the disease which plagues the Western world. It is certainly the play that is made in Washington and also with the European Union. Allow me this just to begin. The last war is a much shorter war. It was an operation of sorts, but it was called a war that Israel fought in Gaza was in May of 2021. In May of 2021, that war lasted 11 days. There were 4,369 rockets which were launched by Gaza, by the PLO, by Hamas, by the Palestinians against Israel. 4,369. And Israel was proud to boast that the Iron Dome was able to intercept about 90% of them, and therefore the casualties in Israel were minimized. Allow me to begin with this two-sentence news story which followed, and I'm going to read verbatim. Until the 2021 war in Gaza, the United States contributed a total of $1.6 billion to the Iron Dome defense system. After the end of the May 2021 conflict, Israel asked the United States for another $1 billion for replenishing the Iron Dome batteries, which was approved by the U.S. Congress on September 23rd, 2021. There's something terribly, fundamentally wrong with this entire thing, and we, to a great degree, we supporters of Israel, are somewhat to blame. The war in Gaza was not the first war, the one that's being fought now. There was a limited war 2008, 2009, December, January. It ended with the ceasefire. There was a war in 2012. It ended with the ceasefire. There was a war in 2014. It ended with the ceasefire. And the war that I just spoke about in May of 2021 ended with a ceasefire. The fact that Israel was so thankful, Israel and Naftali Bennett and Benny Gantz thanked Lloyd Austin, the American Secretary of Defense, for the United States approval of new batteries for its Iron Dome missile defense system. What was lost here was the fact that if an Iron Dome system was still necessary, then the ceasefire might have been a mistake because you didn't end the enemy. The fact that they had to approve an additional $1 billion for the Iron Dome meant that all parties recognized that there was going to be another round of war. And why would Israel, if Israel was winning the war, why would they allow a ceasefire if they, by admission, understood that there was going to be another round? And today, where do we find ourselves not having once again learned the lessons of history? We're talking about a ceasefire. And Israel is actually being criticized by the United States, the Biden administration, the Blinken administration, which is fraudulently called a friend to Israel. All of a sudden, they're talking about a ceasefire so the war can end. A ceasefire simply means that it ends for now. There's a terrible, terrible, and an obvious misplay here. Israel needs victory. Israel needs to win. Israel needs to destroy its enemy. Israel needs to incapacitate. Israel needs to damage its enemy such that there will not be a threat to the citizens of Israel again. And that isn't what's happening. As we do this broadcast in Israel, American negotiators are meeting with and colluding with the Egyptians and the Qataris, and behind the scenes with Turkey, to undermine Israel's ability to win the war. And I will say, as I've said many times in the broadcast with you, Mayor, the lessons of history seem never to be learned. We're talking about a ceasefire. The United States talks about giving Israel more arms. More arms to do what? To do what? To fight its next war? My God, if that's the case, end this one. and end it the way that it needs to be ended, with a total victory for Israel and a destruction of Israel's enemies. That's my
Absolutely.
opening comment.
Absolutely. Cynthia Ray, um, maybe you could explain a little bit what this strategy is, the tactical civilian sacrifice.
Yes, sir. And my opinions here are not from anybody I work for or have worked with, but it is not tactical civilian sacrifice is a very strong strategy. It's not a human shield strategy. It's a human sacrifice strategy. And the tactic is to turn on your own civilians into devices of world sympathy, turn the hearts outside of your area to plead your case and make them compassionate for you. For example, medical staff, they take an oath when they become a doctor or a nurse, and they say they're not going to treat one political issue over another one. They're going to treat the human race. And so to see this out in front of everyone and to have this videotaped, it's civilized people, they don't do well with it. The contrast and the stark contrast is what American soldiers have. And they have two rules of engagement and the law of war. And the rules of engagement define the way in which you engage with the enemy. They aim to keep soldiers acting legally and ethically in war. Guidelines are set by laws and accepted practices. The goal is to lessen harm and make war more humane. It defines the way in which we engage with the enemy and to minimize anything to do with casualties, not interacting with civilians. Soldiers must show the difference between civilian and military targets. This stops attacks that can hurt people not involved in the fighting. Only targets helping the enemy can be attacked. And they help keep civilians safe at the time. So that's your rules of engagement. Then you have the law of war. And the law of war goes back to your Geneva Convention, the Hague Convention, and the NATO guidelines. And the Geneva Convention basically protects people in war, the fighters, the prisoners, and those who are not fighting. These rules they're not to hurt civilians, but to treat prisoners kindly. This affects how soldiers act, making sure they follow the rules. The Hague Convention talk more about how battles are to be fought, including which weapons can be used. The weapons that can cause too much pain or methods that harm innocent people or buildings. For example, hollow bullets, you can't use those anymore because they maim and don't just injure. They adopt napalm in Vietnam. You can't do that anymore. That's considered inhumane. Now, the NATO guidelines create a new way for its members to approach war, combining Geneva and the Hague Convention. And this set of rules helps in place where different laws might clash. So when you have two different cultures or two different sets of rules, then this is the highest legal and moral standard. And that's what Americans deal with, and that's what we play by. In fact, we're probably the only country on earth that actually punish our own soldiers for war crimes if they commit them. Most people, it's just Jacksonian to the winner takes the spoils. But the law of wars are crucial for deciding how wars are fought. These laws work to make war less brutal and to protect people's basic rights. However, you're not dealing with that culture. And with the population you're dealing with, you're dealing with a lot of ignorance. You're dealing with very poor health issues among the women, particularly. Often, dental care seems to be one of the top reasons that they end up passing away at very early ages. But it's in direct conflict to a tactical civilian sacrifice, where there is no regard for human life. And with media-driven cultures now, it would be it's just a direct and harsh contrast.
Wow. Mayor, let me ask you, from how she described and defined the idea of tactical civilian sacrifice.
Yeah.
When we see the protests all over the world, the pro-Hamas gangs, and in fact, descending on the DNC right now, I have never heard from this crowd and their support base, which is primarily within the Islamic community leadership and major organizations, unfortunately, I have never heard any criticism of Hamas from them. I have never heard anything that they're not protecting the civilians, so-called civilians who were cheering on October 7th. But be it as it may, I have never heard any word of criticism. And yet we have the president, Joe Biden, saying, they have a point. Mira, what could you add to this?
Yeah, there are quite a number of things I want to say. First of all, theoretically, what the point that Cynthia makes is a very valid one. That's the assumption that the clash is one of civilizations, as Sam Huntington used to refer to. This isn't a clash of civilization. This is a clash of savages versus the civilized. And we can't lose sight of that fact. Also, I should amend one of the things that she said. Israel, as we speak right now, is investigating some of its soldiers because they thought they were somewhat excessive in defending themselves against the Arabs. I did my master's thesis in the mid-'70s, and it was a comparative analysis of, it was about terrorism in the Middle East. Terrorism in the Middle East, ideology, strategy, and tactics. What I did is a comparative analysis of the Jewish underground movements of the 30s and 40s, the Haganah, the Irgun, and Lehi, as opposed to the Palestinian movements of the 60s and 70s. Mind you, I wrote this in the 70s. And clearly one was a just, this nonsense that's passed off as a truism. One man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. It's nonsense. It's absolute nonsense. This notion that we are fighting when we fight Hamas against the people who follow rules and guidelines established by the Hague or the Geneva Convention is nonsensical in the sense that they, the Arab side, and one only needs to go to the Hamas chart of 1988 to understand that they don't recognize that there are any civilians in Israel. For Hamas, and they make this perfectly clear every single day on their Arab social media, every Israeli citizen is a soldier. Every Israeli citizen is guilty. Every Israeli citizen, children included, need to be killed. This is what they believe. Now, I'm going to reach back in history, and I do have a quote. As you know, the people who watch this broadcast, I always have the appropriate quotes ready to go. But I want to go back quite a while to one of the great military historians of all time, the Prussian military theorist. I'm talking about Karl von Clausewitz. Here's what he said then, and it certainly is true today. He said, kind-hearted people might, of course, think that there was some ingenious way to disarm or defeat an enemy without too much bloodshed, and might imagine that this is the true goal of the art of war. Pleasant as it sounds, it's a fallacy that must be exposed. War is such a dangerous business that mistakes which come out of kindness are the very worst mistakes of all. When one fights an implacable enemy that doesn't recognize your right to exist, when one considers every citizen, elderly, women, and children to be soldiers who need to be murdered, the rules of engagement as described by Hague, the International Court of Justice, are meaningless. They become almost laughable. Israel has one obligation in fighting the war. It probably is the most important rule of war. You need to win. And if the enemy is an implacable enemy that'll do anything to destroy you and your children and your nation, and understands that every ceasefire that is called for is nothing more than an opportunity to rearm and strike again, that enemy needs to be destroyed, but by whatever means necessary. And for Israel, and I say this as a major criticism of Israel, the way that it is structured today, is so subservient to the criticisms that come from the Hague and other international bodies, that during the actual prosecution of its war, it actually calls for an investigation of its own soldiers, whether or not they were too heavy-handed in doing what? In suppressing the terrorism that killed their children. This is a madness that needs to be rectified. What Israel needs to do is win the war. Dresden, when the Allies bombed Dresden, that might have violated with some people what Bernie Sanders certainly would have thought are the rules of engagement. The rules of engagement for these people who represent the liberal leftist world is the white flag. It's the surrender. It's maybe they're killing us because we're doing something wrong attitude. And that needs to be put aside. Israel needs to win the war because this is not a war between two countries that we might have seen yesteryear in history, in modern history. This is a war launched by the savage against the civilized, and it needs to be treated and ended as such.
Let me chime in for 1 second real quick. Is backing up a little bit to the civilian sacrifice. We need to win the war. We also need to somehow compete in the public relations war. I'm going to put a very short video. I'm just going to show you a couple of seconds of it. I'm going to tell you what it says. Just as we finally realized what tactic civilian sacrifice is, some Palestinian group put out a video saying, why are there no bomb shelters? Because Israel is blocking the supplies from coming in to build them. You got to hear this. This just came out.
Why are there no bomb shelters in Gaza? Well, you need construction material to build those. And who controls what construction material goes in and out of Gaza? Israel. Israel has been striking Gaza in retaliation for Hamas's surprise attack on Israeli civilians on October 7th. Now, more than 2 million Palestinians living in the densely populated Gaza Strip, which is a piece of land roughly twice the size of Washington, D.C., are left to seek out shelter in places like schools and public areas when attacks happen.
They're able to build 300 miles of tunnels with air conditioning, with heating, with sleeping quarters. Yet, according to this video...
Back in 2007, Israel imposed a blockade of Gaza's airspace, sea access, and borders after Hamas took control of the Strip. Israel's government claims the blockade has helped protect Israelis from Palestinian rockets and cement that could be used to build bomb shelters.
They're saying that we blocked the rebar and cement from getting into Gaza, and that's why they don't have bomb shelters. This is about 10-minute long video. That's all I can stand right now. You guys, I'll show it to you later. I'm going to check out again. But I want to discuss the fact that we not only need to win the military war, we need to somehow compete in the public relations war, because now the whole world thinks that we let it out finally, there are no bomb shelters. The world thinks it's our fault there are no bomb shelters. So I will say before checking out is that he who comes to kill you, get up early and kill him first. That's it, the Torah, and that's my comment for the evening.
I'm sorry, I know I just finished. I need to opine here. Israel faces a kangaroo court. Now, whereas I agree with you that Israel's Hasbara, its PR program, needs a major overhaul, I don't give a damn what Burundi or Cambodia or Australia or England thinks right now. For Israel to try to be more moral than the savages that have targeted Israel is nonsense. This is what we've done is we played into their hands. We've seen every poll that's come from the Palestinians, polls done by Palestinians of Palestinians, in which 98% of the Palestinians post-October 7th said that they were proud to be Palestinians because of the massacre and the butchery that we saw on October 7th. 87% have said that they actually support Hamas. And if there was an election between Hamas and the so-called moderate, and I say so-called, it's nonsense, the Palestinian Authority, these innocent civilians aren't innocent. And for Israel to have to adjust what it needs to do in order to save its own children, because we want BBC to offer a better profile of what Israel is doing, is the reason we lose. What we need to do is the moral thing, and the moral thing isn't to spare those people who come to kill your children. That is the immoral thing to do. And unless we get that straight, we will continue to lose.
That's true.
There are actual seminars right now at the DNC in support of Hamas. At the Democratic National Convention, there are actual forums, and the speakers are people who support Hamas, and this is acceptable at the Democratic National Convention right now going on.
And what
And
they did, they formed a coalition. Let me just add, there's a coalition right now in Chicago. It's the Pro-Hamas, it's the Black Lives Matter, it's the Marxists, it's the Socialist America. They all got together, just like when Black Lives Matter started protesting, all of a sudden the Palestinians jump on board. It's like they have this staple device. They staple themselves to other causes. And that's what they've done in D.C. I saw the signage when I was looking through the videos of the Marxists of America, the Social Democrats of America, and Hamas, and they're all doing this together. So that, I agree, that's what's going on.
so, Cynthia, the psychology of this, what they call themselves a Gaza civilian population, how does one even comprehend them, to even talk to them? There was an interview with CNN, who I'm not a big fan of CNN, but nonetheless, they had one of the spokespeople from Hamas on, and the person from CNN asked them pointedly, does Hamas assume any responsibility for the civilian deaths in Gaza? And the guy couldn't get an answer out of the guy, period. Nothing. No accountability for anything. So when we're talking about this strategy that they have, the whole psychology that they have, and then it's echoed on our streets in North America by these marauding Hamas gangs, intimidating and threatening our way of life here.
One of the things that you said early on, and you used the word fundamental, and in fundamental, you're looking at basic concepts.
Yep.
Thinking that people will draw a logical conclusion to what they're seeing. Our culture, sir, in the last 10 years, and it started, I think, pretty much with the Kardashians, not blaming them, but at the time when it started, is that social media has driven into their values and what is become the standard for living, and a hierarchy of what's a value. And so instead of thinking critically and thinking logically, people are being fed, and the propaganda is strong. It's powerful, and it's something that's appealing. And that, to me, is one of the big logical words that they have. It's there's really not a problem. You don't really need to do anything about it. This doesn't affect you. This has been going on for 600 years. You don't need to pay attention to that. You know, it's not going to ever come to your house. It's not going to come into the United States. This is a long way off. When in truth, I'm in California. It's not a long way off. It's not a long way off at all.
Right.
It's in the United States Congress. It's in the hearts and minds of the Ilhan Omars of this world and the Rashida Tlaibs. That's where it resides. And they are very venerable members of the Democratic the Democratic Party. And we need to wake up. We intelligent people. It's remarkable. We've spoken about this before. The American Jewish vote has gone overwhelmingly for the Democratic candidate, to the tune of over 70%, almost always. It has dropped. It dropped in the last election, 68%. That they vote for a party which actually has a platform which is anti-Israel. And they also, to a great degree, fund much of what that party does. We're suicidal in what we do. The Jewish commitment the American Jewish commitment seems to be to liberalism rather than Zionism, liberalism rather than Judaism. This is insanity. We have to call it out for what it is. I've noticed a number of articles have been written, including one or two by a good friend and colleague of mine, in which they're really optimistic, in which they said that they actually believe that the American Jewish vote in the November 5th election, which is coming, is going to be quite strongly Jewish. It's going to be pro-Israel. It's going to go Republican. And they group those three things together. That American Jews have somehow had an epiphany, and they're waking up and they're going to vote in a much stronger degree for the Republicans. And what's the percentage, this optimistic number that they hope might happen? 40. And they said in some cases it could even be, which I certainly don't believe, 50%. So what they're telling me is were telling us is that the American Jews have somehow had an awakening and realized that the Democratic Party is anti-Israel, does nothing about the anti-Semitism that we see on campuses in the streets of America. And American Jews, brilliant as they are in everything that they do, have had an awakening and will actually vote. Almost half of them, or 4 out of 10, might actually vote for the party that serves them rather than the party that opposes them. This is a mental disorder.
The mental disorder, sir, is that there's no perceived danger. It doesn't affect us. It's okay. It's not us. It's going to be somebody. And our culture also here says, if you are very intelligent, then you accept all people the way they are, which is a myth in and of itself. You have a real enemy. This is a real threat. This is a real threat to America.
I agree completely, but there is a perceived danger more than there had been before.
That's
The fact that American Jews are beginning to move slightly, and it's an embarrassment for me to say slightly, in the right direction, isn't because of October 7th. It isn't what happened in Israel on October 7th that they decided to move slightly in the right direction. There was a perceived danger on their part because of the anti-Semitism that one sees at Columbia and Harvard and Northwestern, because there's the danger of an American Jew walking the streets of Brooklyn and he might be beaten up because he's Jewish and so on and so forth. That perceived danger, it's a very selfish attitude, to be very honest. And that attitude is, oh, my ox might now be gored and I'm going to take a more serious attitude about it. Contrary to what some people have thought, it wasn't because of October 7th. American Jewish attitudes didn't change because of the massacre of October 7th. It began to change, and it's changing, thank God, somewhat because of the greater perceived danger to their own self.
Yes,
very
sir.
selfish, and somewhat late as well.
Until you bring it home and you put it into your house, they were not going to have a direct impact. I'm sorry,
Right.
but Americans come from a very selfish culture.
Right.
Let me toss in a comment there, because although I'm in total agreement that Jews have and continue to vote Democratic, okay, most Jews in America are in New York or California.
That's
Those
correct.
states are going Democratic anyway. So if there are 6 million Jews in America and every single one of them, not in California, New York, votes for a candidate, it will not change the outcome. So even though we get blamed by the capitalists for being a bunch of Marxists, by the Marxists for being a bunch of capitalists, but the reality is there's not enough Americans, there's not enough Jews who vote in America. Now we can influence our friends, our colleagues, our children. Mayor, chime in, because that's always bothered me. If every Jew in America votes, doesn't change it.
I just have to say something. What you said is completely right, but you neglected one most important fact of all. The fact that the Jews are only 1.8% of the American population is a very relevant factor. One would say insignificant unless it was going to be a really close election. But American Jews contribute 50% of the money that's raised by the Democratic National Committee. And that is an absolute control of what happens. If American Jews said our money will no longer go to the Democratic National Committee, everything will change. And
Okay.
I can promise you this: it's not going to happen.
Yeah, I agree. That is an excellent point, which does to some degree neutralize my point. So I always say I stand corrected, but that is a good point.
It's valid.
Yeah.
It's unbelievable. We're like our own worst enemies in the community.
Yeah, as they say, we love to say, as
There it
Mayor has said many times, we have met the enemy and he is us. No shit, Sherlock.
Oh, too good. Oh my God. Wait, I'm sorry. I always come armed with all the quotations. I write op-eds quite frequently, and I always find the appropriate thing. I have so many that I could throw.
Go ahead.
Especially for the discussion that we have. There was a famous magician. He was actually the fellow who would follow Uri Geller around the the fellow who's always bending keys and using his illusions and all this type of thing. And his name was the great Randy, James Randi. He was a stage magician, and he was is a renowned scientific skeptic. And he had a great quote, which I think is appropriate here. He said, "There's a distinct difference between having an open mind and having a hole in your head from which your brain leaks out." Not exactly the most Churchillian of quotes, but certainly as relevant as anything that Churchill has said.
Yeah, no kidding. No kidding. It's, when you just think about it, it's just mind-boggling what's going on. That at best, 50% of the Jews in the United States will vote Republican, and 50 or 60% are staying with the Democrats, and that half the financing of the DNC is from Jewish contributors. And they can shut it down if they want.
I consider myself somewhat of an expert on American Jewish life, historically and present. If that vote for the Republican Party, and in this particular case, not because I'm pro-Republican, but against the Democratic platform, which is so injurious to Jewish interests, if that passes 40%, I, as an expert, will stand in shock. In shock.
Right. Right. Well, it is a little bit of an improvement from, I think it was 20% before.
No, for the first time that Trump ran, he got 24%. And
Okay.
the last time that he ran, and mind you, the last time that he ran as a very pro-Israel president, with everything, the defunding of the PLO, the closing of the PLO office, the moving of the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, all the proper things recognized, and he went up from the 24% in 2016 to 30% in 2020. So it shows you it really doesn't matter. American Jews, their devotion, tragically, is to the Democratic Party, to the liberals. I've said quite facetiously, and maybe it isn't as facetious as one would think, that if Heinrich Himmler was running on a ballot, but there was a big D after his name on the ballot, American Jews would vote for him as well. This is, and I remind you of a lecture that I used to give quite regularly, and it was always upgraded to meet the subject of the day: the myth of Jewish intelligence.
Yeah, no kidding. We don't see it in the United States. The Canadian Jewish community is a little bit behind the American community. I think it's a little bit more traditional here in Canada and a little bit more cohesive, but we certainly don't have the numbers of that you have in the United States. But thank God in Israel, it's a more healthy Jewish community there that traditionally votes more on the right, especially now. And in fact, in the army, soldiers, they don't want to leave. They want to finish the job.
Yeah.
And they understand what's going on.
Allow me to throw this in, if I may. I'm sorry.
Yep.
Because we were talking about, in fact, the moment we get done here, I'm going to tune in, of course, the Democratic National Committee. We're talking about the possibility of a Kamala Harris becoming president of the United States.
Yep.
And I wrote an op-ed in 2016 in which I said, one can easily forecast what's going to happen with the American presidency by simply looking at the people who surround that particular candidate, their group of advisors. And if we go back, of course, to Hillary Clinton, we had Sidney Blumenthal. I wrote the piece about Sidney Blumenthal and the pejorative role that he played. Sidney Blumenthal, you're talking about John Kerry, you're talking about Samantha Power, you're talking about Valerie Jarrett, you're talking about all these people who were so viciously anti-Israel, okay? Funded by, to a great extent, also by the George Soros dollars. Well, let's jump ahead and apply that same standard now. There are two people that American Jews and American non-Jews as well, who support Israel, need to be concerned about. Vice President Kamala Harris, National Security Advisor, her go-to guy when it came to foreign affairs, who she knows nothing about nothing. And I don't think that that's a double negative. I think that's sort of a very factual comment. She knows nothing about nothing. She has Phil Gordon, who gave a speech in June of 2024, talking about just 2 months ago, in which he basically was saying that Israel and Gaza and the Palestinians need to put away the fighting, and they need to find some kind of common ground, which ultimately is going to lead to what? Of course, the two-state solution. Let's reward the terrorists. But there's a more disturbing appointment. The appointment that she has, that was just made recently public, of Ilan Goldenberg. Ilan Goldenberg is an Israeli-born advisor. He is chosen as her liaison to the American Jewish community. He's going to tell them not to worry. Kamala Harris is wonderful for Jewish interests, for Israel and everything else. He is a vicious leftist. He's a J Street darling. He believes that Israel needs to be forced to retreat to the pre-67 borders. Again, I say the pre-67 borders, which anyone who knows anything about Jewish history or Israeli history knows of the 1949 armistice lines. So her liaison with the American Jewish community, who's going to go and speak and say, I was born in Israel and I'm Jewish, and she's a wonderful plus for the American Jewish community. And the American Jewish community, I go back to the myth of Jewish intelligence, is going to believe, oh my God, she's got an Israeli born, and not understand that the policies that he professes are to the left of Bernie Sanders. This is a disaster. It needs to be exposed, and it isn't, because American Jews are too gutless. And American Jewish organizations, well, American Jews rely on American Jewish organizations to think and tell them how to think. The issue of critical thinking doesn't exist. And the fact that all of a sudden we have someone who's going to be speaking on behalf of the candidate and possibly the next president, who basically believes that Israel should be compelled to go back to the pre-67 borders, is a tremendous danger to the state of Israel, a tremendous danger. And yet, we're blind to it. Stevie Wonder sees it. Helen Keller sees it. American Jewish organizations, with the exception of perhaps the Zionist Organization of America and the Americans for Safe Israel, AFSI, or maybe the only two Jewish organizations involved politically who can see what's happening. The handwriting is on the wall, and we need to react to it. Ilan Goldenberg, a name that nobody knows now, but you'll get to know, because he will be the court jester, playing the role for the Democrats, trying to convince American Jews that what you see and what you hear isn't what you see and what you hear. We are in for a terrible, terrible time if the Democrats win in November. A terrible, terrible time.
I'll add to that I predict if they win, they're going to promote Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar to very serious positions.
They will recognize Palestine. In fact, even if they lose in November, they have until January 20th to recognize Palestine. And I really fear, if you look at what we see in front of us, the handwriting on the wall that I just made reference to, they will recognize Palestine.
Yep. Yep. Okay, so we're coming down to the end. Let's have closing remarks. Cynthia, you've heard what we're talking about. Let's go. Some closing remarks.
Gentlemen, I think you really can't add much to what you've already had to say. You're accurate. You know your facts. You've done all your research, and you're absolutely right.
Thank you.
I can't agree more.
Mayor?
Yeah, let me give you a little historical. I'm going to bring in Gaza into play. I'm going to bring in the Arab enemies. I'm going to bring in this nonsense about what must be going on right now in Jerusalem and also in Egypt, where the United States is actually taking sides against Israel, trying to broker a surrender by Israel, because that's what it is. There was a suicide bombing that took place on January January 22nd, 1995, at the Bet Lid Junction in Israel. It was the first time, actually, that the Palestinian Islamic Jihad used suicide bombers, and they killed a number of people. And there was a comment that was made at the time by the Knesset member representing the Moledet Party, Rechavim Zevi, who called for the transfer at the time. He was a brilliant Israeli general, knew how to combat terrorism. His party was considered right-wing, and he advocated the transfer because he said there was no real peace that could be gotten with the people, some indigenous to the area, who wanted you dead. And by the way, let me just throw this in before I quote and end with a quote that I want to offer. He was assassinated at the Hyatt Hotel in Jerusalem by an Arab terrorist in 2001. But this is what he said in 1995. And for me, angry as I am with the way that Israel is surrendering and capitulating to pressures which are coming not only from the Western media, but also from all the Western countries, this is what he said at the time, speaking about the enemy that Israel is fighting. I'm going to quote. Zevi said in 1995 the following: "The Arabs believe that whoever fights dies as a martyr and comes closer to God. I say one of our fighter helicopters armed with missiles can bring 1,000 or 2,000 Arabs closer to God." End quote.
Let me make a quick comment, which won't actually be the closing comment, but you mentioned the amazing Randy earlier, who, and it's good because magic, we Jews, we believe in miracles, certainly, but one rare thing about the amazing Randy, he was Canadian, but he was not Jewish. But Jewish magicians throughout the ages dominated magic, from Houdini to Keller to David Copperfield to David Blaine, Ricky Jay, Thurston, Penn of Penn and Teller, Uri Geller. But the best were the Danish family magicians, and his name was Fu Manchu. His real name was David Bamberg. And you can go look him up. Go look up Fu Manchu when you finish. He was a lineage of 3-generation magicians. The reason I know this, by the way, is because, believe it or not, I worked right through medical school doing this. That's me on a stage show doing the magic. Okay, so, and the girl in white is my esthetician. So that's how I know the history of Jewish magic. So those are my closing comments.
Okay.
Mayor?
Yeah, I'll add one thing to that. I appreciate what Gary said. Quite enlightening. But just one last comment. He's talking about all these great Jewish magicians. If there's one thing we know about magicians, everything they do is founded on distraction. Well, as we say goodbye now, I'm going to go turn on the television and watch the Democrat National Committee, the convention, excuse me. And what you're going to see coming from the mouths of the Jewish politicians, the Bernie Sanders and the Chuck Schumers and all the fraudulent others, this Dougie Emhoff, the second gentleman, and all these people. All these people, you're talking about Israel, the American ambassador to Israel, Jacob Lew, all these people who talk about we're Jewish and we believe that Israel should, in essence, surrender. They are the greatest magicians of all because they deal with distraction, and American Jews buy it, hook, line, and sinker.
Now, one quick little correction. Among magicians, we don't call it distraction. The word is misdirection.
Misdirection. Thank you, Gary. Thank you. Thank you. Misdirection. You're right. Thank you very much.
Misdirection.
Yeah.
Well, the purpose of the podcast is to get the Jewish community to focus properly on what is correct, what our paths should be, what the Jewish idea is, who the enemy is, focus on it, and also understand who is getting in our way. What leaders there are in our community that are creating distractions, that are misleading the community. They have to be fully exposed and moved to the sidelines so that the Jewish community understands clearly what the threat is, what we're fighting for, and we have to win.
Amen.
There's no turning back. on the memory of my grandparents who were massacred in the Holocaust. It's just that way. Never again. And we go forward, and we're not afraid. Never afraid. And we'll win.
Amen.
Everybody, please share this who's watching it on your social media platforms. We'll reach a lot more people, and thank you very much. One question before we sign off. Gary, you're in the studio, so a sampling of some of the comments from people who are watching, if you could just enlighten us on that.
Sure. Okay, so we had that everybody agreeing with us that the comments that it's the jihadists, it's jihadists in Chicago. It's not pro-Palestinians. It's not Democrats, progressives. It's pro-jihad. So thank you very much. Davy Boy 007 gave that comment, and a lot of them was just nice job, guys.
Thank you.
Okay.
And some people who had to get off the show, they texted me privately and said, "Thank you very much. We need to leave, but we look forward to watching the recording." So that's that.
Very good.
Let's see what other comments. There's a lot here. Yeah, and going along with what Jolowitz said earlier, Jews gives 50% of the funds to the Dems, and we expect it to be supported in return. Similarly with the universities. And the problem now isn't only Jewish progressives universities, but Qatar and Iran and China are contributing to universities, and that needs to stop. And if you look at the Green Party candidates, who are they? It's a Jihad Jilly Stein, Islamic, so for sure. There's some comments about Coop continues to defend the October 7th actions of Hamas. Once again, the Gaza supporters openly refer to October 7th as an act of liberation.
Yep.
Yeah, and the fascists are looking on and smiling. And as I said earlier, this has become a coalition. And this is a good term for it. Somebody put in that it's a jihadi Marxist alliance. So
right.
Lots more comments, most of them pretty much echoing either thanking you guys or that the Gazans, as we know, the Gazans have military centers and schools, mosques, other populated areas, but no bomb shelters. And the nerve of somebody to blame Israel for no bomb shelters when they built 300 miles of tunnels.
Again, thank you guys.
That's it. Okay. Oh,
thank you very much.
Thank you all.
Excellent. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Over and out. Look forward to watching this in the video. If you missed any of it, everybody, you can catch the video, which is going to be ready immediately. Over and out. Bye, Mayor. Bye, Mayor.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.